Welcome to the first webinar in our second webinar series. Thank you for joining us today. I would like to thank our sponsors, the Port of Newcastle and Macquarie Business School, and also thank our supporters, Centre for Workforce Futures and Michigan State University's Broads College of Business. We'd like to start off with a technical overview. If you'd like to ask a question of our panelists, please send it via the Zoom Q&A button. And we welcome your questions and observations, and we'll try and address as many of them as we can. If you're having technical issues, Carlos from our IT team is here. So either email him or send him a message on the Zoom Q&A button. Thank you, Carlos. My name is Norma Harrison, and I'm from the Macquarie Business School in Macquarie University. I'm the Professor of Management. I'm going to serve as your moderator for our session here today. We've got a great team here providing support for this webinar. I'm assisted by Dr. Roger Moser, by Razia Tavaloy, and Elena Liangjia-Ji, all from Macquarie Business School. The first webinar in the series is called Coping with Disruption Through Innovation and Digital Initiatives. In this webinar, we have an interesting group of presenters, all leaders in innovation and supply chain applications, and we will meet them very soon. The first speaker is Arnoud de Meyer. I have known Arnoud for over 3 decades, since he was an assistant professor in INSEAD in Fontainebleau, France. He rose up the ranks quickly and steadily, and as the director of INSEAD, he opened the Singapore campus. Fast forwarding, he was appointed Dean of the Judge Business School in Cambridge, UK, and then served for some years as the president of Singapore Management University, SMU. He's an internationally recognized researcher, particularly in R&D and innovation management. And more than that, he lives the life of an innovator, as evidenced by his taking SMU to great heights as the president. I have been particularly impressed with his love of art and music and his generosity in sharing his time with friends and colleagues. I present to you Arnoud de Meyer.
Thank you, Norma. Thank you for having invited me for this session. I'm going to talk about innovation and the use of business ecosystems to innovate in the supply chain. We can perhaps go immediately to the next slide, right? My starting point for all of you is basically that since we live in this period of the pandemic, that we actually will not necessarily see that much disruption. That may come on a longer period of time, but in the short and medium time, I'm actually convinced that this pandemic will accelerate a number of trends that we have already. Acceleration, for example, of the slowing down of globalization, what I called here on my slide, the slowbalization in Asia. But because of the China-US trade frictions, there's actually a big risk that we also see an increase of actually logistics, shipping around as a consequence of the requirements of the country of origin. Of course, there will be rapid digitalization. People will question the efficiency of our just-in-time supply chains or the drive for efficiency, and will perhaps look more for robustness and responsiveness. And then finally, the point I really want to make here today is that the supplier-buyer relationships will actually go from a pipeline to an ecosystem. Indeed, supplier relationships or supply-buyer relationships are supported by a growing set of integrated services in logistics, finance, insurance, inspection, and authority. And in fact, supply chains is not a chain, it's an ecosystem of trade. Next slide, please. Yes. And I have written recently a book about how to innovate through ecosystems together with Peter Williamson from the Cambridge Judge Business School. But we went back actually to the fact that many organizations work in an ecosystem, not necessarily very formal relationships, but a network of organizations and individuals that actually try to create more value than they could do on their own by co-evolving their capabilities and roles and align their investments so as to create additional value. So the 3 points important in this idea of ecosystems, that is, it's about value creation together, it's about a network, a relatively loose network, and about co-evolution of capabilities and roles. Now, these ecosystems are much more powerful to innovate and to scale up very quickly, which is very important in these difficult times today. Can we have the next slide? The advantages of ecosystems, as I said, is that you bring partners together with diverse capabilities, and especially that you actually create a lot of flexibility, so enabling your partners to adjust their activities quickly. It's low asset intensity because you don't have to own everything. You can work with your partners, and you can actually, as I said, scale up very quickly. And I sort of, without going into details, refer to 2 recent examples that you may actually Google later on. That is Haier Cosmoplatz, which is a platform, and it's the same actually for Schneider Electric in Batam here, close to Singapore, where they have developed a platform on which companies can actually cooperate with each other, collaborate with each other. So suppliers, distributors, customers, actually also vendors, engineering companies, they come to that platform, and because they are sort of connected on that platform, they can very quickly realign themselves and come up with new products, which is what Haier did during the pandemic, to come up with some very interesting new ideas. And they could do that because they could mobilize on that platform their traditional vendors and suppliers very, very quickly. Can we go to the next slide? Gartner, well-known consultant in telecommunication, basically has sort of recently published a paper on what they see as the role of information technology and ICT, etc. And they said in the early 2000s, it was really about a focus on the value chain, doing better what you already do. And you see sort of it's under that number 1, the value chain, suppliers, enterprise, customers. In the second wave, and that was sort of the beginning of the 2010s, they see a focus on creating new services and using platforms to deliver them. The traditional Uber, Life, Grab here in Singapore, Airbnb, and whatever approach. But they say that since about 2018, the technology is a lot more about getting influence in the ecosystem, exerting influence, but not necessarily controlling the whole ecosystem. And that's what I'm really talking about here. Because we all live in supply chains, we all live in ecosystems, we all live with partners. The challenge I really have here for you today is, how can you think about to use these ecosystems to your advantage?
Arnoud, Meyer, all well and good, but how do you do that? You talk about leadership. How do you connect the leadership in this whole ecosystem?
That leads me, actually, it's a good introduction to my next slide, Norma, where I said, look, we looked at a number of case studies. I'm not going to go through the details of it, but you see Alibaba, you see Thomson Reuters, you see The Guardian, very different company, Amazon Cloud Services, Rolls-Royce here in Singapore, very different companies in very different places of the world. If we go to the next slide, which is really answering your question, you can go to the next one, sorry. We sort of discovered 6 steps to kickstart the development of your ecosystem, sort of 6 ideas of how to get that ecosystem working for you. And the first one is really demonstrate that you believe in an ecosystem attitude. I have this example of the Ford Motor Company, which was not on my previous slide, Norma, but Ford Motor Company in 2011, or the senior management, the CEO actually, declared that they wanted to go for ecosystems to develop autonomous vehicles. So really intention at the top of the organization. So they start working with a number of these smaller software companies, mapping companies that produce maps like Google Maps, etc. But very soon, in the tradition of the Ford Motor Company, the middle management wanted to get control over the supply chain and started to buy these companies, started to integrate them in their supply chain, and they went to their old ways of developing cars. In itself, not bad, but not for that highly uncertain environment in which they had to operate. So you have to demonstrate that you believe in ecosystems. Secondly, you have to co-opt customers that are willing to work with you in a very loose collaboration, coping with uncertainty without being sure what you're really going to do. You have to develop a roadmap. You have to tell people where you go. That doesn't mean that you have to have everything detailed and in planned, etc. But you really need to make sure that the people that are going to co-invest with you know where you're going. You need to have that roadmap, basically, of where you want to go. Of course, you need to communicate the value of joining. Why would companies join you in your ecosystem? What's in it for them? You have to, of course, shrink the entry barriers to join the ecosystem. If you come up with very complicated contracts, if you make it very difficult to join the ecosystem, then companies will not join in that loose communication. And then you may actually want to look for partners that bring their own ecosystems. To take an example here of Rolls-Royce in Singapore, they built a factory here in 2010 and needed to have about 2,000 skilled workers to work in the production of aircraft engines. The closest factory of aircraft engines here to Singapore is in Japan, 6,000 kilometers away. There were no skilled workers that had any idea of how to do this. So they had to build up that workforce of about 2,000 skilled workers. And of course, they came to the universities, they came to the schools, they came to the unions and said, how can we build up that workforce? And they built that ecosystem in which they said, look, this is what we want to do, this is what needs to be taught. They gave a roadmap. But in order to build the ecosystem very quickly, they also went to the Economic Development Board, which brought with them their own ecosystem. They brought a partner in through EDB that brought their own ecosystems within the government. So Rolls-Royce here in Singapore was a typical example of, we want to build an ecosystem. We're not going to teach people the skills that are needed for the production. They co-opted foundation customers, the universities, the polys, the institutes for technical education. They made a very clear roadmap of what was needed to build up that skilled workforce, and not only a stock, but also a flow of it. Communicated clearly what was in it for the schools. They would actually be able to have jobs for the graduates. Made it very simple to work with Rolls-Royce, and as I said, brought on board EDB. That are 6 steps to kickstart the development of the ecosystem.
Yeah, I think this is very interesting, Arnoud, but what are the disadvantages to ecosystems?
Norma, you asked the difficult questions, right? It's true that there are disadvantages, because if you work in that loose sort of environment, you obviously have transaction costs. Even if you don't go for a lot of contracts, if you make it simple to collaborate with each other, you have inefficiencies through transaction costs. And if you go to the next slide, you will see that I have here enumerated a few ideas to improve productivity, such as writing contracts that focus on very high-level outcomes, but leave room for flexibility, and make sure that these contracts are fair. Otherwise, you lose time and money and resources in trying to sue each other. You need probably to create portals to smooth the path of data exchange between ecosystem leader and the partners. You need to develop a set of systems and organizational solutions to manage exchange of what often is very complex know-how, not very, it's sometimes fuzzy, right? If you innovate, you don't necessarily always know what you're going to do. So it's complex know-how. Make sure also that you somehow can codify some of the complex and tacit knowledge. But I would say probably the most important of all is building trust between partners. People that trust each other will be able to work together in an ecosystem. And then finally, you have to make sure that there are no free riders. In any loose collaboration, there may be companies that say, I want to take an advantage of this. So you need to be able to penalize bad behavior. Alibaba, which I have referred to, that is one of our case studies, is very good at building actually peer review of the people that are, or the companies that are on their platform. And it's the peers that actually penalize bad behavior of some of the partners on the platform. One of the great advantages of working in an ecosystem as opposed to an aligned lean manufacturing type of vertically integrated supply chain is that you actually bring partners together that have very different capabilities and insights, and that you actually speed up the learning in the network. And I have here a few comments about how you can stimulate learning and innovation. But it's often about how you communicate and make accumulate, as I say in my fourth bullet point there, the accumulation of ecosystem goods, like a little bit like sort of free goods in society, but ecosystem goods, knowledge that is part of the ecosystem that you actually can share with each other, use with each other. I think that is one of the big advantages of an ecosystem, the very fast learning. But of course, as I said in my last bullet point, make always sure that you keep something for yourself, because you will have to make money in one way or another. So you will have to have some proprietary knowledge that is not shared within the ecosystem.
That's a very important point, and I'd like to explore that a little bit more. Thank you, Arnoud de Meyer. Very interesting take into the learning and innovation in ecosystems. And I'm sure there will be questions later. At this moment, I'd like to introduce to you Laurie Underwood. Laurie has spent more than 20 years in Greater China. She works closely with China's CEOs, hence her success in co-authoring best-selling books on the China CEO in 2020, 2006, and the China Entrepreneur, 2009. She's also a contributing researcher to the annual CSR white paper in the last 2 years of China-Europe International Business School. Laurie Underwood is the Senior Associate Professor of Management Adjunct for Xi'an Jiaotong-Liverpool University's International Business School in Suzhou, as well as a Senior Consultant with Sino Associate Global. She was Communications Director Air Pacific for Air Liquide for some years. I met Laurie Underwood when both of us were working at CIBS in Shanghai, and she as the Director of External Communications and Development. And most impressive to me were her wide connections and skills, also as an ambassador of whichever organization she was working in. Another thing that was impressive, and for which I am envious, is that she speaks fluent Mandarin and French. She is a committed jogger and giving up her morning run to be with us today. So I present to you Laurie Underwood.
Thank you so much, Norma. It's really a pleasure to be invited to join this impressive panel. And just by way of introducing myself, this first picture here is of International Business School Suzhou. So if you ever have a chance to come to Suzhou, please look me up there. That's my main focus of work right now. And if you do the second picture, I'm also a consultant with Sino Associates. This is a picture of our recent presentation skills class for decathlon. So I love working in Shanghai, Suzhou area, and doing my combination of teaching in the classroom and working with companies. But today, if you show the next click, I'll be talking a lot of information from my new book, about the theme that Norma asked me to talk about, disruption via innovation and digital initiatives. And what I'll pull from is the book that we just published called China CEO 2. So this book that I had the pleasure of working on has just come out. And so it's given me a lot of data to help with today's panel. So let's go to the next slide. As Norma mentioned, China CO2 is the second book on this theme. So my co-author, Juan Antonio Fernandez, he's the Associate Dean of CEIBS. We've written 3 books together, and the first book came out in 2006. So there's been a lot of changes in China, as you can imagine. And the biggest change is the rise of China in terms of as a digital player. So this is the theme that kind of matches best with your panel today. So China CEO is based on interviews with 25 people holding the name card China CEO for multinational companies, as well as 5 consultants. So the opportunity to work on this book has given me most of the data that I'll share today. Let's go to the next slide. And I'm not going to list all of the companies and CEOs, but just to give you a quick glimpse, we tried to interview people from 25 very different companies. So you can see Meyer in there, Lego, L'Oreal, Microsoft, Carrefour, Coca-Cola. You can go to the next one, even Victoria's Secret. So we had really a large span of different types of companies. And then these are the consultants that we also interviewed. So I'll try to pull a little bit from different relevant quotes from the book to match this theme. One of the biggest changes between the first book and the second book is that we also interviewed 20 CEOs from multinational companies who had the name card China CEO. But in the first book, all of those interviewees were men, and none of them were Chinese. In the second book, 13 years later, 1/3 of them were Chinese nationals. So that was a big change in terms of the leadership of multinational companies in China towards more Chinese nationals. And 4 of them were women. So 2 interesting changes that have really tell you a bit about where China is today. Let's go to the next slide. So the first quote I'll give you talking about the theme of digitization and disruption through innovation comes from Yuan Shaolin. He's the president and CEO of Volvo Car Asia, and he's obviously one of the Chinese interviewees. So he helped me to set the scene for what has happened in China in recent years in terms of digitization. And this quote, I think, sums it up nicely, that people around the world are looking with amazement at the development of the internet in China, the rise of the BAT companies, Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, but also the smaller niche ones that we might not know as well outside of China. So that's why Shenzhen has really become known as a second Silicon Valley. And the idea that it's not just the big digital leaders, but they have created an ecosystem similar to what Arnoud was talking about, in terms of creating a culture and giving the right environment for lots of little companies to develop as well. So it's a really exciting and interesting moment to be in China. So of course, the big game changers, Alibaba and Tencent, from the 2 Mr. Ma's. And one thing that came out in the book is that not only are they, changing the business environment, but they've changed the goals of many of the young generation. So this has completely shaken the position that multinational companies have long held as the desired place to work in China, so that many young people and even experienced people are preferring Chinese companies over multinational companies these days. So the level of shakeup is really huge. So let's jump over to Microsoft. One of the most interesting people that I interviewed was Alain Crozier, CEO Greater China for Microsoft. And he told me that, Microsoft has had challenges in China in terms of being copied, but they really landed on their feet and have created a very positive environment for themselves to work in China today. And one of the things that Alain explained to me is that what he's trying to the message he wanted to give, that he said even sometimes he needs to give within Microsoft, is to help people to realize the transformation that has happened here in terms of innovation. So his interview was one of the most clearest examples that China has really changed in the past 13 years from not being a place of innovation, from being a copycat culture, into actually leading innovation, true innovation. So this is one of the key themes that he brought out. And he's saying that that the Chinese companies that Microsoft works with are not just innovating in terms of creating interesting new products, but new business models. So much deeper kind of true innovation than might be realized in the outside world. So, and another last thing that Alain mentioned is that to survive in today's environment in China, this also matches a bit with Arnaud's talk. He said he needed to change his mindset about competitors. So he still competes a lot with some Chinese companies, but he also partners often with those same companies. So he needed to change the mindset from a kind of rigid competitor versus partner to frenemies kind of environment where the lines are blurred a lot of times. So that was one of his key points. Another point from the China CEO of Sony was talking about the fact that there's many technologies that are being developed only in China or first in China. So this idea that we're not copying things and bringing them to China at all anymore. In many cases, we're developing them first in China and then bringing them to the rest of the world. So he mentioned a few, hardware products such as voice-assisted TV. For Sony, it was tried and tested in China first, and then it will, be coming to the outside world. So another interesting change that Takahashi mentioned as a natural trend given China's place in the world economy now. So I wanted to just give a little bit of data on WeChat. It's something that every time I give a lecture, I have to update the numbers, and every time the numbers are going up. I know most listeners are very well familiar with WeChat, but just to reiterate the power of WeChat as a social media platform in China and the difference that it makes in that almost everyone is on one single platform. There's not a fractioning of some people using WhatsApp and some people using Facebook Messenger. It's just everyone in China is on WeChat. And so what that allows companies to do is to much faster and more efficiently test things. So, you can put an ad on WeChat and you can know after a day what might take you a week to know in the West, because you need to test it with different platforms. So it just allows the speed and efficiency to be much more advanced in China than in other places because of that. So I just wanted, and it's always interesting for me to look at the number of hours that people spend on social media in China and how it's rising so rapidly. As a professor of young people, I think the average can be a lot more than 2 hours per day for most Chinese. But anyway, this number is also something that I regularly track, and it's always going up. Okay, let's go to the next one. Yeah, the last quote from a CEO comes from Kurt Ferguson. He's an excellent interviewee, the president Greater China of Greater China and Korea for Coca-Cola. And I was asking him the question of what is next for Coca-Cola in terms of digitization and customization and tracking of consumer needs, because that has risen to such an extreme advanced level in China. And he told me an example, which was kind of a joke, but not that far from reality, that with today's technology, you could easily track a consumer, for example, going on a bike ride, a sports ride. You could know where they were. And after they'd been riding for 30 minutes in the 40-degree summer heat, for example, you could send them a note, are you thirsty? If you need to buy water or a drink, here are the locations near you selling Coca-Cola products. So he was saying that, you know, these are the levels that we're getting to, and it's kind of spooky, but that's where the digitalization and customization and consumer tracking is headed in China. So, okay, let's go to the next one. I wanted to just end with some quotes from Jonathan Wurzel. He's also in the book, but the quotes that I chose are not from the book. They're from one of his regular reports. He's one of the people I read regularly. He's such an expert on China. And so if anybody, you know, needs data on China, you can always look up Jonathan Wurzel. But basically, he was explaining that, you know, 40% of worldwide e-commerce transactions are now coming from China. It's the world's leader in digitized consumer-facing industries like e-commerce. And then just, you know, to mention the scope of what China is advanced in today, it's virtual reality, autonomous vehicles, 3D printing, robotics, drones, AI. When you're in China, you can see the use of face recognition in you know, increasing very rapidly in terms of entry of buildings, making purchases online, making purchases at consumer stores, making purchases with your phone. It's really taking off faster here than in other places. So I wanted to end my part with a few of his information. And basically the point in this article that I pulled from is that, you know, China is continuing to move very fast, and that by 2030, you know, China will be even more advanced than it is today, potentially creating 20 to 45% of industry revenue from digital will come from China, McKinsey estimates, by 2030. So it's definitely, you know, something to track and to continue looking for China to be a leader in that. So let me end with the...
No,
yeah,
before you end, Laurie Underwood, I wanted to ask you, since there seems to be more of the CEOs from China itself, Greater China, is there still a demand for MNCs, so multinational corporations in China? And in fact, will there still be a demand for expats in China?
Yes, excellent question. And, you know, like I said, there's a big shift that you can see very clearly in China, and in the two versions of China CEO. That shift played out very dramatically. So there's definitely an increase in Chinese taking the top role in China, which makes sense. And there's also a definite shift in the position that multinational companies hold in China. I think today it's not so much a question of, you know, is there a need for multinational companies in China? It's more that multinational companies need to be in China and are in China. They will stay in China, but they're operating in a much more collaborative way. It's no longer, you know, multinational companies bringing technology. In some cases, of course, they still are bringing advanced technology to China. But even in the most advanced cases, even with Bayer, for example, they were talking much more about collaboration than bringing technology to China. So it's become flatter, it's become more two-way. Definitely both sides need each other. And I hope that Arnaud's term of slowbalization is the key word now, and not a stop in globalization. I think that, yeah, so, but it's much more a two-way street, that multinational companies want to be here, need to be here, and are actively participating. And probably also multinational companies that succeed in China today, they need to very carefully match the government's values and goals. So moving up in the value chain, moving away from high polluting industries, making sure that they give back to China as much as they take out are probably the rules. And in terms of the role of expats, definitely there is still a role, but I would say that a big difference between the first and second book is that the level of commitment that the non-Chinese China CEOs made to be in China, in terms of learning Mandarin, in terms of having China expertise before they took on the role. So those were two big changes that I saw between the two books. All right, should I jump to the last? Yeah, I just wanted to leave you with a couple of strategies that come from the CEOs in the book. The first one is to invest in R&D in China. In the first book, there were still people telling me that maybe they wouldn't invest in R&D in China because of an intellectual property rights protection. Nobody was saying that now. The second one, innovate in China for the world. So use this wonderful petri dish kind of atmosphere that we have in China where you can test things out digitally and see if they work or not. And then what works, you can bring to the rest of the world. Prepare for a cash-free China. If anyone's been to China, well, not recently, but before COVID, you've already seen that it's almost cash-free now, and it's really moving in that direction. So that's another change, and it's probably a leader for other countries in that way as well. And the last one, yeah, tap the digital natives. So any of us who are working with young people know that, you know, they have a lot of expertise. A lot of the companies were saying that they created like reverse mentoring systems where young people can introduce digital technology to their older senior executives in a friendly way and keep everybody up to speed.
Thank you, Laurie Underwood. You've certainly given us a different lens and a wider view of the China CEO and how innovation is really being created down there, and why companies are really flocking to situate themselves in China. So at this point, I would like to introduce Mark Toohey. Mark Toohey is a multifaceted and successful entrepreneur, starting off as a commercial lawyer, working with major law firms, and then as a general counsel in the media, telecommunications, software, and IT industries. He's also a company director, a company secretary, and an entrepreneur. In fact, I call him a serial entrepreneur, a bit unkindly, but in this case, his startups have been very successful. He co-founded and built successful Bitcoin and blockchain businesses, and he's applied these to his companies like Aglive, which develops leading-edge evidence-based tracking and authentication technology for the food production value chain. And he's a managing director at Aglive still, and he's the founder of Flock2, which is the first true multi-channel event marketing platform, and the founder of Adroit Lawyers. He still finds the time to lecture in digital currency regulation for the University of Nicosia in the online Masters in Digital Currency course. So I present to you Mark Toohey.
Thank you very much for that, Norm. Well, we're building very much a distributed enterprise, to use the term that Arnoud gave it. My blockchain company was acquired last December by another company that has expertise in farm management software. And we're really trying to build the leading paddock to plate solution, blockchain solution, and link the farm through to the consumer. I can have the next slide, please. So Australia has some natural advantages. For those not familiar with the beef industry in Australia, every animal is given an ear tag that's like a birth certificate. Every animal is identified. Every cow in Australia is identified. Every property is identified. So that's a good step in the right direction, but there's still a lot of complications. There's state governments, state and territory governments, there's different rules regarding health, safety, biosecurity, and then there's a lot of paperwork. So what we're trying to do is take the information out of all those different data silos, and there's some on the farm and there's others afterwards, and we're trying to bring it all together into a digitized system that is quicker, easier, and more convenient. If I can have the next slide. Our other aim is to help producers earn more money. Australian farmers are really challenged with droughts, floods, fires, and now COVID, which is impacting supply chains and distribution. And so the real challenge is to earn premium prices for premium products to make more money out of the same amount of work. An example I can give you is if an exporter can send chilled meat rather than frozen meat, they can earn $5 a kilo more for that production. So the challenge there is you can't send meat unfrozen, chilled, unless you can be sure that it's going to stay within temperature range and won't spoil. And now IoT, Internet of Things, helps with that. A blockchain for storing that information and it being reliable is a key to earning a much higher price. Next slide, please. So we work on storing information. The key information we're storing is the identity. I already mentioned the ear tags that help track animals through their life. The location, we have those advantages in Australia of each identity having each farm having a specified number, and then also the condition, both of the animals on the farm and also of the products after they've been processed. This one shows an overview of what we're trying to build. If we start off in the middle, you can see the icon of a cow. We capture that on-farm information, processing information, transport information, logistics and warehouse information, and sales information. And all that goes across into the blockchain. We can add in there Internet of Things information, information contributed by customer systems, partner systems, and of course, once you've got all that information, you can start to apply machine learning, AI to it, and come up with brilliant new solutions and even new products. That all, oh, sorry, just if I could just go back to that one for a second. It all goes into a data lake there. And of course, people get to take information back out of that data lake. That is the blockchain. Regulators can get information, consumers, alliance partners, and also there's room for analytics and all sorts of dashboard insights. I can talk more about that afterwards. The next one, please, Norma. Now, all these companies that are in the supply chain, they have spent a lot of money on their own data systems and their data security. And it's very hard to allow too much access in that. There's been a large number of data breaches in recent years. So blockchain is a handy system where no one's making themselves too vulnerable. Instead, they give a snippet of data into the blockchain that securely stores it. And no information goes into that system until it's been checked by the participants and they agree that it's valid, and that's through a voting system. And of course, the commercial principle is whatever information a participant puts in, they're able to take out more data than they put in. Now, this is a bit of a personal thing for me. We are building an enterprise system, and enterprise can't really run in a very large, very integrated system like the supply chain. You can't have the software concept of just move fast and break things and beta testing and minimum viable products. You have to have the aim of building something that's more akin to the television world. I've worked in both areas as a general counsel for one of the major TV companies in Australia. In my period there, we did all the cricket, the rugby league, the Australian rules, all the motor racing, the Sydney Olympic Games, the Commonwealth Games, and in about 9,000 events that they did while I was in that company, we only ever had one mistake. And it was about a couple of minutes of audio outage during a rugby union game. That was it. An error of one time in 9,000. That's because the TV industry always sends out at least double the number of resources they need. They have two entire systems. If one falls over, the second one kicks in. on the really big matches, they not only have the power set up, then they have a backup power system, and sometimes they have a backup system for the backup system. So they have 3 levels of redundancy. The rugby league grand final will not fail because of a power outage. They just build it that any failure is completely unacceptable. And that is a system that we're trying to bring into the supply chain world as well. So we're working with meat companies, Meat and Livestock Australia, that's the peak industry body, large trucking and companies like DB Schenker, airlines like Cathay Pacific. They've all got a vested interest that if they can build a system that really does things the right way and uses technology and new systems, they can create new benefits, such as the chilled meat. Now, the reason people haven't been flying meat around is the systems were not right. Sometimes the meat would be taken out on a tarmac, and of course, in the hot Australian summer sun, that tarmac temperature could be well into the 40 to 50 degrees level. That meat only needs to be on that tarmac for a few minutes, and it starts to really endanger the quality of the meat. So we've got to build a system where it only comes out of the chilled area at the very minute it needs to, and it goes straight from there onto the plane. No sitting around, no waiting. We need to build resilient, reliable systems that make that happen. Cathay Pacific are keen to do that. DB Schenker want to be involved, and that's the things we're working on. Now, all of this, of course, is about selling meat and giving customers the assurance that if they're paying a higher price, they're getting what they're paying for. No one wants to be fooled by paying a premium price for a substandard product. So we apply our QR codes to the product. This is a free app that consumers can use. We check the code is genuine. We check the logistics all makes sense and the item's in the right place at the right time. And we also make sure that that code hasn't been sold before. Next one, please. We can give deep consumer information about the product, about the people that handled the product, how it got to that market. And of course, the consumer can also scan numerous products and see their scan history for other products as well. Next one, please.
Before you go to the next one,
sure.
Mark, I just noticed that your Aglive platform appears to be designed towards supporting premium prices. Can you explain a little bit more about the reasons behind this approach?
Yes, well, as I said, farmers are very challenged. There is so much pressure on farming at the moment, and probably the people that make the least out of the product is the farmer. They often are price takers. They bear all that risk of flood, fire, and drought, get minimum returns on their product. And a lot of farming is borderline viable, given all the headwinds against it and all the business risk. And that's why we're seeing the age of the average farmer in Australia is now in their early 60s. A lot of people are not taking it up because of the challenges. And it's a major industry for our country. It's of significant importance in the world. We need to make sure farming is viable into the future. I believe technology can change those dynamics. Now, another problem we've seen, one of the brands we're working with, they've had 3 incidents in recent times. The most recent was a couple of weeks ago where someone went into their facility, took photos, and then started selling substitute beef and saying that it was their product. It makes it really hard for someone to protect all that investment in marketing, and then it can be ruined by someone buying substandard meat that said it is that premium product. Years of hard work can be lost.
Thank you, Mark. That's been a very insightful journey. You've taken us for the necessary ecosystem of industry and the connection through digital technologies. So we'll get back again with some questions. Before we do that, let's have a look at some of the takeaways. These are our takeaways here, and I don't think we can cover all of them, but maybe we can go to Arnoud. If you can talk a bit more about all organizations operating in ecosystems.
We all work in ecosystems. This is actually, by the way, nothing new. If you go in the United Kingdom or in England to a little town, you will always find in the middle of that town a commons. And a commons was where people would put their cattle together, their sheep, their goats, their cows, and would sort of manage it together. And if you go to Java and you sort of admire the little rice terraces and all these little terraces that all need to use the same water, again, farmers need to work together with each other in an ecosystem, in a very loose network to manage the water flow over these terraced rice fields. So commons, terraced rice fields, ecosystems are actually a natural way of working together. It sort of disappeared a little bit at the end of the 19th century when we strive for more efficiency and economies of scale. But the point I really want to make is we all work in ecosystems, whether we pay attention to it or not. In my executive education, I often challenge people and say, draw the ecosystem in which you work. But there's one condition: don't make it a hub and spoke system in where you are at the hub.
Yeah.
See it as a network of peers.
Yeah,
I think
but we really need to start rethinking this way.
Yeah. Yeah.
And reframing how we operate. Laurie, could we have some takeaways from you about China emerging as the world's innovator?
Yes, I think the main thing I hope that people would come away from this talk with in mind about China is just the fact that that China overall has shifted so dramatically from being a manufacturer of the world, from even being criticized as a copycat country, into a true innovator, not only developing convenience-based e-commerce, but actually new business models. So it goes along again with Arnaud's theme of ecosystems. I think in China, they're developing digital-based ecosystems in a very real way and shaking up and disrupting through technical innovations. It makes it a very exciting environment to be in. So if one little phrase to take away is that I think China has shifted from being different, from having different systems, to now being a leader, to being first in a lot of digital innovations.
Okay, and thank you for that, Laurie Underwood. I'd like to go to Mark Toohey, if you can give your quick takeaways here.
Sure. The key word for blockchain, if we were to replace that word with any other word, it would be collaboration. And all blockchains do is store information, just the same as a database does. The key thing that's different is it allows numerous people to combine their data and to collaborate and to build business in a different way. And so it's come up from all different angles in our discussions today, this theme of collaboration and new business models, and not frenemies, and not directly always having to go head to head in competition, that something new and something different is possible when we work together. And blockchain is simply a tool that allows that.
Right. Thank you very much. Before we get on to the panel, and there's really not much time left for that, but I just wanted to invite you to our next webinars in the series. The second one is on looking at supply chain cybersecurity. Webinar 3 we'll be looking at restoration and reconfiguration through digital and analytics. And the 4th one is looking at digitalization, the new normal for logistics and transportation. So at this point, I would like us to be able to talk amongst ourselves. Let's have a look at all of us here, and there are a number of questions that have come in, and so how do I decide? So the first one is a question from Elizabeth for Laurie. So are we talking about competitive collaboration, and how does trust work here without landing up in the lap of lawyers and regulators?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So I go back to the quote from Alain Crozier from Microsoft saying that, you know, he's both competing against Chinese digital players and, you know, collaborating with them, sometimes on the same day, you know, but on different projects. And he said it's just a very complex, chaotic even situation in China. So of course they try to maintain, you know, contracts and a sense of legal obligation and things like that. But there's no doubt that, you know, it's a complicated and chaotic situation. I think overall, one of the things that came out this time around with China's CEO is that China has evolved. It's now a world player. And so the legal system it's not to say that there aren't legal issues, but it's more developed, and it's in some ways easier to have the legal standards followed than it was in the past.
And once we have you here, Laurie, I'm combining 2 questions. One is from Mosen, who says, what's your view on the impact of the trade war on business in China? And that is somewhat like another question that you've got, which is, how will the trade war with US impact China's digital transformation? So a bit unfair to ask you those questions, but have a go.
For sure, it's a big question on everybody's mind in China. We've been watching, you know, the whole thing play out over the past year. We didn't address it very directly in the book. We were hoping that by the time the book came out, it would be better. Things would be better. For sure, there's an impact. Of course, the big factor will be what happens with the U.S. elections, which I'm not an expert on that either. But I think, you know, China's digitization is going to continue whether U.S. trade relations get better or not. So it's my hope as an American, of course, that we will come back closer to China as fast as possible so that we can collaborate instead of, you know, clashing. These issues that are coming up now, trade and digitization are definitely linked. There's threats to block WeChat and things like that in the US. So the 2 things are very much linked. But I know that me, and I speak for most business people here, you know, hope very strongly that the situation will normalize as fast as possible.
Questions for Arnoud. So let me think. Okay, so this is quite complicated. Firaz Dayab has asked, considering the trend in renewable energy, automation, and push for local jobs, which should reduce the cost of energy and make labor cost irrelevant, shouldn't this make local production increasing and therefore cause more globalization and result of supply chain being more co-located? I remember, Arnoud, we had a quick conversation about this, but you go ahead and give your take on this.
Yeah. I actually do believe that we have probably gone a bit too far with lean manufacturing, lean supply chains, which were extremely focused on efficiency and not necessarily on robustness and resilience. We've seen during the pandemic that a number of countries suddenly came to the conclusion that they were totally dependent on China, to put it bluntly, for even simple products like masks. With the discovery in Europe was that nobody was able to produce a very simple product like a mouth mask in sufficient quantities and rapidly enough. So I do think that we will go to a world where if it's not business government will actually impose more robustness to supply chains and more control over what they would consider strategic products. And strategic products are not necessarily defense related, but they can be simple food. Here in Singapore, the government we are importing practically all of our food, but the government has now a new goal of 30% of the food should be produced locally by 2030. So 30 by 30 is sort of the slogan they use for that. So even there you see that there is a pressure from governments to get more control over the chains, the production chains. But that doesn't mean that we have to bring back cheap labor manufacturing to, for example, Australia. You want to have more local production, but you probably want to have the high value added ones.
Exactly, so that was what we were discussing as well.
Slower globalization, yes, I believe in that. Don't think that we will see what the growth that we have seen over the last 20 years, but globalization itself will not go away.
Right, okay, thank you. Mark Toohey, very interesting question for you, and we'll have to finish off pretty soon, but this one I couldn't resist. How is consensus, this is from Ravi Sarati, how is consensus reached on the validity of data in the Aglive example, and how is IoT data secured, preventing data emanating from IoT devices from being manipulated or changed before entering the blockchain for validation?
Okay, well, for those...
Very technical.
Yeah, for those who are not familiar with this process, the blockchains work on a consensus basis. There's various consensus models, proof of work, proof of stake. We're working on a hybrid of proof of stake and proof of authority. Simply means the people that have a lot of say are those that have most of the risk if bad data gets into the system. As far as all those security protocols, we're very mindful of this. We have security experts, both internal and external. We're building the system to, as much as possible, not only validate information as it comes in, but to also cross-check information to look for anomalies. And it's a topic we could talk at great length, but we understand the importance of building a system that's robust and verifiable. And that goes back to my point about the television approach as distinct from the software approach. Whatever we do for enterprise systems, we can't accept shoddy practices. We need to make sure things really, really work. And they're reliable.
That gives you a logic for some redundancy as well, doesn't it?
Exactly. So it's early days. I like to compare to the blockchain industry to the aviation industry. In the early days of the aviation industry, it was just a plane landing on a plowed field. Later on, they developed runways and control towers and flight paths and things like that. Blockchain is in the midst of doing all that, so we can work collaboratively together in a secure way, and we're maturing. But there's still a lot of work in the blockchain industry to come up to the standard of modern aviation.
I think that's a good time to end this, talking more about the collaboration and the power of collaboration. So at this stage, and on behalf of Macquarie Business School, I'd like to convey my sincere appreciation to our panelists, Arnoud Meyer from Singapore, Laurie Underwood from Shanghai, and Mark Toohey from Sydney. We really appreciate you sharing your organizational challenges, industry and research experience, and considerations for coping with disruption through innovation and digital initiatives. I'm also so glad to have my team with me, Razia Tavaloy, Roger Moser, and Alina G. I certainly value your support through the conduct of these webinars. Thank you also for Carlos for helping us in the technical side. We're grateful to our sponsors, Port of Newcastle and Macquarie Business School. Also thank our supporters, Center for Workforce Futures and Michigan State University Broad College of Business. Finally, I'd like to thank you, the the audience for staying this distance with us and your interesting questions. We have so many, but if you look at our YouTube recordings, you will be able to get the emails of our panelists, and then you can inundate them with all your questions. I'm sure they will appreciate it. We will release the recording of this session to all those who have registered, and you are free to use it as illustrations and discussion points at your workplaces, lectures, and meetings. We hope you remain safe and well, especially in these difficult times around the world. Take care of your families, your supply chain partners, your organizations, your customers, and your employees. We wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Norma.